No, I'm not really going to do that. I'm going to talk about Brahms, actually. I could do it. Here, do you want ready? All right. Now, I'm really going to talk about Brahms, I promise. Johannes Brahms, born 1833, dies 1897, so lives quite a bit longer than most of the composers we've discussed and we've mentioned. In the 19th century, again, the era that we call Romanticism, seems to be part of the artist's lifestyle that you have to somehow suffer and die a premature death. Now, we can sort of chuckle at that, but actually the numbers really do back it up. Again, some of the symphonists that we've discussed include Mozart, who died at the age of 35, Schubert, who died at the age of 31, Mendelssohn, who died at the age of 38, Robert Schumann, who made it all the way to the ripe old age of 46. Now, there were exceptions, of course. We started this program series by discussing the music of Franz Joseph Haydn, and we said Haydn lived almost to the age of 80. He was, in fact, 77 when he died. But one of the things that we find when we look diachronically at music from this period is that composers in the late Romantic seem to be less and less prolific. That is to say, they simply write less music. Let me give you an example. Haydn, with whom we began this series, composed over 100 symphonies. Mozart, who died at the tender age of 35, wrote 41 symphonies. When you get to Beethoven, who's often described as sort of the third member of what we call the Viennese school, these composers associated with the city of Vienna in the classical and Romantic eras, Beethoven writes only 9 symphonies. Of course, we put only in scare quotes because when you listen to Beethoven's symphony, I don't think anybody would say that they're missing something or that he was somehow deficient in composing for that genre. When we get to the music of Brahms, now remember, Brahms is born a full 6 years after Beethoven dies. So unlike Schubert and Schumann, who overlapped with Beethoven to some degree, now we're talking about someone like Berlioz, who was born 1803, so he also overlaps with Beethoven. Beethoven would have been about 33 when Berlioz was born, and Berlioz would have been about 25 when Beethoven died. So there's some overlap so far in all the composers we've discussed. Brahms really marks, I would suggest, the dawning of a new era in a sense. He kind of carries music into the late Romantic period. And when you get to Brahms's music, and his symphonies in particular, you get a much smaller number than you had 100 years ago with Haydn. When Haydn was writing symphonies in London, and he was writing symphonies number 94, 95, 96, ticking them off, Brahms, 100 years later, was wrapping up his life, it turned out, with his 4th symphony. A couple of years prior, Tchaikovsky wraps up his life and dies after the premiere, about 9 days after the premiere of his 6th symphony. So what happened? Why are these composers all of a sudden writing 4 symphonies where 100 years ago a composer would have written 100 or 50 or something like that? And I think a lot of it lies in the ethos, that is to say the creed or the convictions of these Romantic composers. They were, in essence, perfectionists in a way that Haydn was not, or Mozart was not. Now, this is not to suggest that Mozart's music isn't sort of perfect in its own way. I think in week 1, when we looked at his Jupiter Symphony, we saw in it a sort of crystalline beauty and perfection, especially in that finale. But I think it's fair to say that Mozart's approach was completely different. How so? Well, let me paraphrase a line from the movie Amadeus. In the movie, Mozart is sort of burning the rope at both ends. He's got the midnight oil going as he's trying to finish new works for commission so he can pay the bills. These include, most notably, in the late summer and early fall of 1790. 91, he's working on an opera called Die Zauberflöte, the Magic Flute. He's working on a clarinet concerto. He's working on his Requiem. And in the film, Emanuel Schikaneder, who is the impresario and the librettist who's written the Magic Flute words, the story, if you will. And he barges into Mozart's apartment at night and he says, "Mozart, where's the score?" And Mozart says, "Don't worry about it, I've already finished it." And Schikaneder breathes a deep sigh of relief and he says, "That's wonderful. Where is it?" And Mozart points to his head and he says, "It's right up here." And then he has a great line, which I think is probably reflective of how the real-life Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart thought. He says to Schikaneder, the rest is just scribbling. In other words, for Mozart, the hardest part about composing is just putting the notes on paper. He's like a stenographer. It just comes to him and he writes it down. And I think in the Romantic period, these composers look back and they kind of had a very grudging respect for Mozart, but they would never hold him in the same esteem as Beethoven. Why not? Because Beethoven suffered. Beethoven anguished and agonized over every little decision. Let me give you an example. Beethoven's Third Symphony, the Eroica Symphony. Beethoven thought for over a week about whether the movement should end like this or like this. Do you hear the difference? It's there. Listen to it again. Do you hear that? This one has a little bit of brightness in that note, what we call the third of the chord, or if you like solfege, this is do, mi. So the mi is in the top voice in the flutes and violins, or to end here. Now, again, I think it sort of proves the point. Most of us shrug and say, what's the difference? But to a romantic artist, you have to agonize over every decision. Nothing should be easy. Nothing should be the way that Mozart describes it in the movie Amadeus, the fictionalized version of Mozart, when he says the rest is scribbling. This idea of just being an automaton where some divine conduit hits you and you just write, the Romantics are not interested in that. They're interested in pain and suffering. Let me give you some examples. Beethoven was a great composer. Well, sure, the Romantics worshipped him. We talked about that last week with Hector Berlioz. But why did they worship Beethoven? Not just because he wrote great music, but because he wrote great music when he had no business doing so. And he had no business doing so because he was sick and losing his hearing by the age of 30, and probably by the age of 37, 38. That is to say, when his Fifth Symphony is premiered, he's completely deaf or close enough to make no matter. So that's what the Romantics loved. And you go down the line. Schubert dies, and he dies, doesn't die peacefully in his sleep. He dies from syphilis, complications from syphilis. His brain sort of deteriorates over a period of a couple of years. His health fails him. His eyesight fails him. His memory fails him. His cognitive abilities to speak and to write music, they fail him. Frédéric Chopin dies of tuberculosis. Robert Schumann went nuts and decided to go for a swim in the Rhine River in the winter of 1854. This idea that a composer is somehow unstable, it becomes part of the mythos, part of the perception of great artists. A great artist should suffer. Nothing should be easy. And that brings us to Johannes Brahms. We're going to look at just a fragment of his First Symphony, sometimes referred to tongue-in-cheek by commentators as Beethoven's 10th Symphony, because it resembles Beethoven in many ways. But I think it's unfair to Brahms to just say, oh, sure, he's just copying Beethoven's style. First of all, that would be false. And second of all, it kind of detracts from the innovation which is present in the symphony. Why do people compare him to Beethoven? For a couple of reasons. Remember last week we talked about program symphonies and how they were sort of all the rage in the 19th century? Because when you have a symphony that's attached to a story, the composer has an opportunity to be very expressive, to come up with all sorts of gimmicks, for lack of a better term. And we saw that last week with Hector Berlioz and the Symphony Fantastique. Remember, Berlioz wants to conjure up dancing skeletons. So what do? You flip the bow on the violin around and you create this sort of strange, creepy sound, the timbre of the wood, the collegno technique on the bow, instead of the bow, I should say, on the strings, wood against the string. You wouldn't do that in an ordinary symphony, right? Because it's not a really pleasant sound. It's a weird, gimmicky sound, and it's very effective for what Berlioz is going for. So while program symphonies were very popular in this century, and a lot of composers sort of jump on that idea of writing music which is based on a story, instrumental music based on a story. Here's another example. We all know this one, right? Well, if you know that piece, you know it has this funny title, Also sprach Zarathustra, thus spake Zoroaster. based on a treatise by Friedrich Nietzsche and composed by the composer Richard Strauss. So that's another great example of it. Here's one by Debussy. I played in the flute. Prelude to the Afternoon of the Faun. So this idea of writing music where you have a story or a poem that you're trying to conjure up, but you're not using singers. It's not an oratorio, it's not an opera, it's not a cantata, it's instrumental music. We call it program music. It's very popular. Here's the guy who swims against the tide. He's not writing program music, and that makes him very unusual in this century. He writes 4 symphonies, and he publishes his first one when he's past his 40th birthday. Remember, Schubert, Mendelssohn, Mozart, these guys never made it to 40. Brahms is waiting till he's in his early 40s to premiere this first symphony. It premieres when he's about almost 43 years old. That's a crazy thought. Let that sink in for a minute. First symphony, and it takes him a very long time to publish it. He had been working on it as early as the mid-1850s. That means he's working on this piece for 20 years. 20 Jahre, right? He's working for 20 years. This is a guy who's, by the way, from Hamburg, and makes his way down, where else? To Vienna. Vienna seems to be the kind of the magnet that draws all the great musicians, and not just musicians. By the end of the century, you've got people like Gustav Klimt and Freud, for example, and many others who are in and around Vienna. We'll talk more about that when we get to Mahler. Mahler, of course, would also come to Vienna. He and Brahms overlapped there. Brahms was about almost 27 years older than Mahler, but they knew one another, and they would have overlapped there because Mahler was already by the 1880s in Vienna. So Brahms is writing not program symphonies, but what we call absolute music. And the idea with this is you're going to write a symphony which we appreciate as an audience simply for the beauty of its sound, for the themes that the composer weaves together and introduces different harmony and rhythms and all the things that you would listen to, or listen for, I should say, in, say, a Mozart symphony. Mozart is not writing symphonies where the music is supposed to conjure up drug-fueled opium slumber where you're having a nightmare that you're in hell and you're watching your own funeral and the woman you love is transformed into a hag and there's skeletons dancing on your script. I mean, that's Hector Berlioz, but it's not Mozart, and it's certainly not Brahms. Brahms' symphonies don't have stories. They're not programmed symphonies. They're absolute symphonies. And in that way, they're very different from just about everything else written in this century, or I should say the vast majority of music from this century, symphonic music. So we get to the finale of Brahms' first symphony, and there's a lot of similarities on the surface with Beethoven. Let me give you a couple. Number one, if you were to look in the New Grove Dictionary and look this symphony up, it would give you, Grove Dictionary gives you the key of every piece. And what it would say about this one is it starts in C minor and it ends in C major. That's right. So what's the significance? Well, go back to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, 1808. Starts in C minor, right? The first movement. C minor, very strong C minor. And how does it end? If you remember the finale. Climbing until we get to this chord, and then C major. So this idea of taking the listener on a journey where you start in minor and you can associate it with any number of different things. Minor traditionally has been interpreted to represent grief, sadness, anxiety, loneliness, desolation, negative things primarily, and major the opposite. So Beethoven takes us on this journey from minor to major, and in doing so, breaks one of the cardinal rules of composition in that period. And they were very strict in the way they adhered to rules back then. If you started in a key, you had to end in that key. Beethoven takes that rule, throws it in the trash. He's not interested in ending where he began because it's about the journey, the trajectory. Brahms is going to do the same thing here. But when he takes us from C minor to C major, he's going to do so in a way that makes it very obvious who he's indebted to, at least, or inspired by. And he does so by giving us a theme that sounds a bit like this. So I'll just play the melody. And then it repeats. Now this part. That's not it. That's not what he does. He does this. So this melody, which is immediately going to evoke Beethoven because it comes right out of the Ninth Symphony. Beethoven's Ode to Joy, right, which is in D major, but we'll play it in C major where Brahms has it. So we hear this. We're expecting this almost. We don't get that. We get this sort of when Brahms was asked about this, he was asked a number of questions about this symphony. First, he was asked by his publisher, what's taking so long? I wonder why, right? Well, we know it took him 20 years to finish this piece, but Brahms had a response to the publisher which has been preserved for posterity and which is an often quoted line when we talk about the influence of Beethoven in the century. And what Brahms said was, you have no idea what it's like to have that giant trampling behind you. The idea being that every time you sit down to write music, you close your eyes and you can't escape from Beethoven. He has this sort of gravitational pull. No matter what you do, you can't get away from it. So while composers like, for example, Hector Berlioz, to come back to him, their tactic for getting away from Beethoven is to do something radically different. Don't invite comparison by writing absolute music and trying to write in the same idiom that Beethoven did. Instead, do something different so you can't be compared to him. Brahms is going to go the other direction. He's going to charge head-on into the Beethoven legacy. And he does so here by composing a finale which is really rooted in a melody that is unmistakably associated with Beethoven. And after the premiere, somebody said to him, Johannes, isn't that melody you used, didn't you sort of borrow that from Beethoven? It sounds just like Beethoven. And Brahms supposedly said, of course it sounds like Beethoven. You'd have to be an idiot not to hear that. And the way he described it was that he's sort of tipping his cap. Remember that by the time this symphony premieres in the 1870s, almost 70 years has gone by since the premiere of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and almost 50 years, in fact, slightly longer than 50 years since the Ninth Symphony. So a lot of time has passed. Because he writes absolute music and because he embraces Beethoven with such alacrity, Brahms is sometimes considered sort of the spiritual heir to Beethoven, his successor in many ways. Sometimes people will use monikers like the keeper of the classical flame, and they'll describe Brahms as sort of musical conservative. But actually, I think that's not fair to Brahms because he is very progressive in many ways, especially with rhythm. And I think most apparently here, as we'll see in just a moment, with his approach to instrumentation, or what we sometimes call orchestration, which is the act of deciding which instruments are going to play which notes. It's one thing to sit there and say, okay, I want this melody. Okay, great. What instrument should it be in? Should it be in the violins? Should it be maybe in the woodwinds? Should the brass come through and announce it? And as we see, and we'll see this with Mahler even to a greater degree, When you get to the end of the 19th century, these composers are really thinking about instrumentation in a way that it's hard to imagine that Mozart or Haydn, first of all, they couldn't have even imagined it because half the instruments, not half, but many instruments didn't even exist when they were writing their symphonies. So there's a lot more instruments that have been created at this point. And some examples of that would be, for example, the tuba, various brass instruments, various low-pitched reed instruments, the contrabassoon. Not that it's an instrument we'll hear in a symphony, but the saxophone is invented in this period. So the instrument makers are making new instruments, and of course, you'll see them later on, especially when we look at Mahler. One of my favorite instruments that was created in this era was a low brass instrument created by, love him or hate him, Richard Wagner. Now, because Wagner was such a modest guy, he was so humble, and he had no ego whatsoever, he decided to call these instruments Wagner tubas. All right. Here's Paavo Järvi, who's an Estonian conductor, and this is the finale of Brahms's first. We won't listen to the whole thing, but we will get to hear that section, which clearly paraphrases Beethoven. So we're still in C minor in this section, but we're going to be transitioning to C major. This is what we call a brass chorale. It's like a hymn, but with brass instruments. There's bass trombone. And here's our Beethoven Melody. It's going to be played in the strings first. Now in the winds, such a different sound, right? I'm going to pause it there. When you hear the melody take off, bum bum be da be dum ba dee da dum ba dee da dum ba dee da dum ba dee da dum. Even that is a kind of nod to Beethoven, isn't it? It's the rhythm from the Fifth Symphony, what sometimes is referred to as the Fate Motif, or in German Schicksalsmotiv. Brahms is disguising it here, but it's there, it's present, and we see this in many composers' works, most notably in Beethoven's, where he himself uses that Fate motif, as in, for example, the Appassionata Sonata. We see it here in Brahms. You'll see it at the very beginning of Mahler's Fifth Symphony, where the trumpet just has, right, da-da-da-dum, is really what it comes down to. So here he's sequencing it. All right, we'll get to the cadence, and then we'll move on. Now, of course, that's not the end of the movement, because as we know, we are going to end in C major, and that was definitely not C major. However, we've gotten a taste here for Brahms's indebtedness to Beethoven. And again, that quote, when he was asked, isn't this just like Beethoven? His response, you'd have to be a bozo not to hear that. But it's just part of, yeah, question. Yeah. It's a great question. The question is, how do transitions, when a composer wants to shift from major to minor, how does that happen? And the answer, without getting into a complicated dissertation on music theory, is carefully. It has to be done carefully, and it has to be prepared. And we have what are called pivot tones and common tones that belong to both keys, maybe. Nowadays, when you listen to music, Disney songs, for example, are notorious for this, or famous, I guess, if you like them. And that is these sort of shoehorn key changes. What I had an old professor used to call them the Barry Manilow key change, where you're in this key and snap your finger, you're in a new key. But in the great works of the classical period or in the Romantic period, they prepare things very carefully. For Wagner, you've got to wait 4 hours to find out what key Tristan and Isolde is in. And he's going to prepare it very, very carefully. And if you analyze the score of it, you'll see it's done very carefully. But usually it's a slow burn, because the thing is, they want to make it sound, they don't want it to be jarring or abrupt. It has to be smooth. And that was how they executed the task, was to do it very smoothly and to do so in a protracted way. One thing about Brahms that I'll say before I move on is that most of the orchestral musicians, if not all that I know, love Brahms. And when I asked a trombone player once, why do you like Brahms? And he said, because he gives the trombone such interesting things to do. So if we might say that people, that is to say, learned musicians and people who play this music tend to really like Brahms because he gives them something to do. Well, if they like Brahms, then they must really love Mahler, because this is what a Mahler score looks like. This is just one page. So let's go ahead and go through it and see how many people are playing in the finale of Mahler's Second Symphony. 2 flutes, 2 piccolos, 4 oboes, 3 clarinets in B flat, 2 clarinets in E flat, 2 fagotten are bassoons, 3 contrabassoons. Count them, 10 horn parts, 6 trumpet parts, 4 posaunen, posaunen are trombones, tuba, pauken are timpanis, glocken, tam-tam, those are percussion instruments, organ, you've got an actual organ in the symphony, and then of course you've got your usual complement of string players, 2 violin parts, viola, cello, bass. All in all, probably some 200 musicians. Here's a cartoon of Mahler from his own period. Not a very flattering one, but the caption in German says, "Oh darn, I forgot to put in the motor horn. I guess I'll have to write a new symphony now." And it's a cartoon. As we know, cartoons are often rooted in reality and in the truth. And the truth is that Mahler's symphonies ask so much in terms of, A, endurance for the musicians. A typical classical symphony, we said, in the days of Mozart or Haydn might have been 25 minutes long. In the days of Beethoven, maybe 40 minutes long on average. There are a couple that are longer than that. The Fifth Symphony is about 35 minutes. The Fourth Symphony, about 35 minutes as well. By the time you get to Mahler, you've got symphonies which are over an hour long, over an hour and a half long. So these are sort of pushing the envelope, raising the bar for what is expected or what is possible, really, from standard orchestra. Now, what are your limitations? I would suggest that one limitation is the conductor. You have to have a conductor that can manage all of this. So there are other cartoons of Mahler where you see him sort of frantically trying to micromanage a huge group of people. And of course, with Mahler, he's also going to tip his hat to Beethoven because he's going to include something in the symphony that really, strictly speaking, doesn't belong in the symphony. And that would be the chorus. So Mahler's Second Symphony famously features a chorus in the finale, just as Beethoven's Ninth Symphony has the chorus singing those words by Friedrich Schiller, Freude schöner Götterfunken, Tochter aus Elysium, wir betreten feuertrunken, himmlische dein Heiligtum, deine Zauber binden wieder, was die Mode streng geteilt. Alle Menschen werden Bruder, wo dein sanfter Flügel weilt. So Beethoven puts words in. It must have really confused the audience in the 1820s. By the 1890s, when this symphony is premiered, there have been, actually, believe it or not too many composers who have tried to work text into symphonies. Again, doing so invites direct comparison to Beethoven. Now, are you going to write a better symphony than Beethoven's Ninth? Probably not. As Wagner famously put it when he was asked why he didn't write symphonies, Wagner shrugged and said, "What's the point? The best symphony that can be written has already been written." And he meant the Ninth Symphony because of the Ode to Joy, the An die Freude, that setting which for so many people, I think back then and still today, 200 years later, it takes the symphony to that next level of expressivity. You can't compete with words. You can't compete with the marriage of chorus and orchestra as we see it in that piece. So this style of music, what we call a choral symphony, it's very bold, decision for a composer to pursue that, because again, you're inviting that comparison. And are you going to do better than this man who inspired the whole century of the Romantics? Probably not, or at least many thought. You can't do better than Beethoven. Wagner is very blunt about that. Wagner suggests you could live to be as old as Methuselah. You'll never write a symphony that tops the ninth. You could sit there polishing and honing all day. How could you beat the Ode to Joy? You can't do it. So where does that leave the rest of us? The rest of us being the rest of us composers from the 19th century. Mahler is a really interesting character because his identity is so sort of fractured and tormented in many ways. He's born in an area that back then earned him the ethnicity Bohemian. Well, when you think of Bohemians now, you might think of people who wear Birkenstock sandals and don't shower very often. But Bohemian, of course, nowadays corresponds to the area that we call the Czech Republic or Czechia. Back then, he grew up in a town that was part of Prussia, and they were German speakers there. So the Mahler family is German-speaking, but really Czech more in terms of their identity, their ethnicity. Moreover, the Mahler family is a Jewish family, so that adds another wrinkle to the equation. And as we know, Mahler came to Vienna. Well, how do you think they treated Jews in Vienna in the 1880s and 1890s? The answer is abysmally, as poorly as possible. The mayor of Vienna in the 1890s was a guy named Karl Lueger. Lueger was a Nazi before there was Nazism. You know, the Nazi party National Socialism dates to about 1919 or so, Dietrich Eckart in Bavaria. Karl Lueger in Vienna was a Nazi before there was a Nazi party. His attitude towards Jews was as racist, as scathing, as belligerent as we would, we who have studied the 20th century would see happening 3 decades later. So when Mahler gets to Vienna, in order to take up the post that he covets and really that he's more than qualified for, to be the director of opera there and to be basically the #1 conductor in the city, he has to convert. So he does so. He converts and he becomes a baptized Catholic. And as he's leaving the church, he's asked by a colleague, Gustav, what was it like? And Mahler says, I feel as though I've changed coats, suggesting it is a kind of an outer, superficial change. And we see elements of Mahler's, call it his Jewish identity in his music. Let me give you an example. His first symphony, the Titan Symphony, has a slow movement, which uses a very familiar tune. It's the melody of what we call in German Bruder Jakob. You probably know it better by its French title, Frère Jacques, except Mahler turns it into a minor key. So instead of bam, 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 it's ya da dee da dum, dee da dee da dum, dum dum dum, and ya da dee da dum, ya da dee da dum, yum bum bum. If you know that movement well, you know that as we get through the A section, Mahler gives us music which is unmistakably, undeniably, incontrovertibly sounds like klezmer. It sounds like Eastern European, Ashkenazi, Jewish sort of the music that we associate with the traveling musicians of that culture. The Viennese audience did not like it at all. It was too Jüdische, it was too Jewish sounding for them. So even though Mahler became a Catholic, his identity was all over the place. He himself would describe it in the following words, and I'm paraphrasing here. Mahler said that wherever he went, he always felt like an intruder. Never home, never welcome. Growing up, his parents owned an inn. And so through the front door, you have travelers coming and clashing their tankards together and saying Prost or whatever they would have said there. Probably Prost because it was a German-speaking town. And, well, let's say L'chaim, right? They're clashing their beer tankards and they're drinking and making all sorts of merriment, the way people relax when they get to a place like an inn, which is sort of a hotel, if you will. On the other side, where his family lives, you could say that Mahler's youth is marked with tragedy. And the great tragedy of his youth is that he was one of 14 children, and of course, about half his siblings died. Some in childbirth, some grew up and were healthy, robust toddlers and then died. Some grew up and died when they were 10 or 12 years old. He had a brother who committed suicide as an adult. So what scholars often say is that Mahler's childhood was marked by, on the one hand, this ebullient, frothy merrymaking on one side, and then on the other side, terrible, sort of heart-shattering tragedy. And the way it connects to the music and the way it's interesting for us is that much of Mahler's music seems to be focused on concepts which are heavy concepts. This is not light listening. This is music which is absorbed with themes that include death, resurrection, the afterlife, heaven. It's not religious, though. It's spiritual. It's a spiritual sense. This is not the sort of resurrection that we associate with Easter Sunday, for example, in Bach's Passion oratorios. It's resurrection in a sense of metaphysical transformation. And we see this not only in his Second Symphony, but in other works as well. Let me give you two examples. In a collection of songs, Mahler was a very prolific songwriter. There's a collection of songs called Kindertotenlieder. If you know German, that seems like a very harsh-sounding title for a musical collection. Kinder means children, tot means dead, and Lieder are songs. So songs on the death of children is how that's often translated. And many Western listeners will wince when they hear that, because even the thought of writing music based on that sort of poetry is very difficult to do. Mahler does it. In the Fourth Symphony of Mahler, you get a finale where we have this sort of child's vision of heaven. And we get very, very serene music, poignant and very expressive. But maybe more than any other piece, it's in the Second Symphony, in the Resurrection Symphony. Here, Mahler is going to be setting text by a German poet by the name of Friedrich Klopstock. But he's also going to supplement it with his own text. And we get a symphony which is over an hour and a half long, which clearly we don't have time to listen to. But we have about 15 minutes. And so we're going to do our best to get to the good parts. And I've chosen here to focus on the finale. Why the finale? Well, first of all, let me say this. There are 5 movements in this symphony. Remember we said that Mozart and Haydn, their symphonies are about 25 minutes long? This movement would swallow up any symphony by Mozart or Haydn. It's about 35 minutes long. It will swallow up some Beethoven symphonies, just one single movement. We've seen the score. Let's look at it again. You could put every musician in town to work on this piece. Everybody has something to do. Even the organist has music to play. There are 2 harps playing in this. The finale is really split into 2 halves. The first instrumental, the second with chorus. We will listen to a bit of the first half, which will introduce some of the prominent themes. A couple of things to listen for. Number 1, the preponderance of brass instruments. The brass is really such an important player here. If you go back to Mozart, the only brass instruments he ever uses are French horns. So here we are 3 weeks from where we started. And look at how much the symphony has evolved. We've gone from Mozart, where you could fit into a room like this, you could do a Mozart symphony. It would be a little tight, but you could do it. Could you do a Mahler symphony in this room? Amara, I believe that would constitute a fire hazard. So, no way. And you'll see that not only do you have over 200 musicians in the orchestra, you've got about 300 singers here as well. And they're singing not words about brotherhood and togetherness, as you find in Beethoven, right? That's what the Ode to Joy is. It's a hymn to universal brotherhood. What you get instead here is text that meditates on death and the afterlife. And you can almost imagine Mahler reflecting on his childhood as he sets these words by Klopstock. So without further ado, here's Gustavo Dudamel, one of the few people who can sort of pull this off. Not any conductor is going to come off the street and decide, yeah, I'm going to conduct a Mahler symphony. You have to have a couple of things. A, superb musicianship, that goes without saying. But you have to often have an incredible memory. What you'll notice is most conductors who conduct Mahler will try to do it from memory. Why? because if you're looking down at the score, you're probably missing something in that moment. You have to live in every measure and know what's going on in every measure. So you have to have unbelievable ears, unbelievable sort of musical memory, the ability to remember who to cue and when. In addition to the instruments that you hear and see on stage, you will hear instruments which are not on stage. Mahler designates a group of 8 brass players that he wants off stage. And he does this to give the symphony this sort of haunting, faraway, distant, ethereal sound. And you will hear a little bit of that. So we'll listen to just a few minutes. The 5th movement begins with what is sometimes called a shriek of nature. This is maybe the death knell, if you will, that's being played by the orchestra. They start with a very dissonant chord. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Here's the main theme. Hear that falling interval? And then it rises. Notice no score for the maestro here. You don't see these brass players because they're off stage. And they're watching on probably closed-circuit television or in Mahler's day with mirrors. And this is, of course, the Royal Albert Hall in London. An English horn. Here's the Offstage Brass once again. I'm going to pause it here. This is just the beginning of the fifth movement. And we're about, 6 minutes into this fifth movement, and we haven't even scratched the surface. But we have heard a couple of important themes. Let me play two of them for you because you're going to hear the chorus sing them. One of them sounds like this. So just this two-note, and then you hear that many times, especially when the chorus comes in. That's the first thing they sing. Another theme that you're going to hear, sung by the chorus and played by the orchestra. And this is sometimes called the resurrection theme. Why? Well, we'll see in a moment. Sometimes you'll hear it in different versions where it will do. So why is it called the resurrection theme? Well, because it starts with a falling interval, what we call a perfect fifth, and then it climbs up the scale. In other words, the theme itself falls and then rises, so is therefore associated with resurrection. Now, in addition to the orchestra, including the onstage and offstage musicians, and the chorus, which numbers about 300 in this production, you're also going to have two soloists, one contralto and one soprano, and you're going to hear them sing as well. So I'm going to skip ahead to where the chorus comes in, and yeah, we'll have an extended listening section here. This, by the way, is a youth chorus and orchestra, as you probably have noticed, the Simon Bolivar Symphony Orchestra with the BBC Youth Chorus. So there's a theme we've heard, right? And rising. There's that resurrection theme, climbing up the scale. And just when it seems it could end on this pensive note, that's not how it's going to end. We get a new theme about belief. I can imagine this text resonating with Mahler. Here's that theme I played earlier on the piano. Now the last chapter. This is about confronting death now. I love that shot when they pan out at the end because I think for us here especially, it reminds us just how far we've come from the days of Mozart and Haydn, where a symphony was what we would think of today as little more than a chamber piece. Yes, maybe not exactly a chamber piece, but you didn't need a conductor to do a Mozart symphony. There are ensembles today that perform in Europe. There's a Swiss ensemble, I forget the name of, that performs without a conductor, and they do Mozart's entire catalog. You can't do this without a conductor. You just simply can't. First of all, you need someone to cue the offstage brass. That goes without saying. But there's just too much happening here. And this is really about the limit of what you can do. Actually, Mahler would push the limit. His 8th symphony, as some of you know, is nicknamed the Symphony of 1,000 because the forces he calls for eclipse even the 2nd symphony. In 2016, the BBC did a survey and they asked people to rank their top 10 symphonies, and they found that 3 Mahler symphonies ranked in the top 10 symphonies among the huge polling data they collected. And it tells us something about Mahler, that yes, he is asking for a lot, both from the musicians, but also from the audience as well. But when you get there, you'll be glad you were there for the journey, because it's a very rewarding journey. Yes, an entire Mozart symphony could fit into half of this finale. That's true. But when you get there and you combine all of the instrumentation, all of these exotic instruments, these pitched percussion instruments, the bells and whistles, if you will. Well, there really are bells, no whistles, but you do have harps, you do have 10 horn players, a whole team of trombone players, and of course, an organ for good measure. It's clear that Mahler has sort of redefined what we as listeners can expect from a symphony. And I think the 2nd symphony is a great example of how he does that. So at this point, I know we are past time, and I know the library is closing soon, but if there are any questions, perhaps I can answer one or two. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that the musicians of this era were always looking backwards to Beethoven.
That's true.
They didn't have iPods.
Yes, they didn't have vinyl, they didn't have iPods, they didn't have digital downloads. So what that meant was they went to a lot of concerts, and if you were musical, you studied the heck out of the scores. And this is, sometimes I'm asked, why don't people in the 18 to 22 demographic, the people I teach, for example, why don't they listen to this music? And the answer is, to a tremendous degree, because they have no knowledge that it even exists. And we live in an era of instant gratification where people want what's immediately available. And unfortunately, that's part of the problem. 150 years ago, if you wanted to hear good music, you had to drag yourself to a concert hall and go see it. And I think it gave you a really profound appreciation for the art of making music. And modern recordings, while it's wonderful, and if you rewind the clock 100 years, I don't think anybody would want to trade places with the people who didn't have recording technologies. On the other hand, it has kind of made, I think to some degree, it has made younger generations very sort of, they take it for granted, and they have a kind of ambivalence towards it because everything is at their fingertips, so it's hard to appreciate it. But if you wanted to know this music or Beethoven's music and you were Gustav Mahler growing up in the 1870s, you'd have to go and get your score, and you'd have to look at it and play through whatever you could, again, looking at what a score looks like. And really good musicians can read this, not at sight maybe, but you can go through it. And when I was in graduate school, I took a seminar on Mahler symphonies, and I had the Dover edition of the Mahler scores, and I would go through it, and I'd mark every measure, and what's the harmony here, and where's the theme, and is the resurrection theme in the brass, and what are the woodwinds doing? And it takes a lot. It's very rewarding, and it will make you a better musician, but... Listen, there's a reason why it's very easy to start a rock band, because if you know 4 chords, you can go out and start a rock band. But doing something like this to learn this music is going to make you a much better musician, but it requires an effort which is orders of magnitude greater. And I think the same thing is true as listeners as well. Yeah.
Did he become comfortable in his conversion, and when he was demanded to convert,
Yeah.
was there a progression in his music that illustrated that he became
No.
believing walk the walk?
No, great question. So this is about Mahler's conversion to Catholicism. There's nothing in any of his music that suggests that he became a Catholic in anything other than name. Let me give you a couple of examples. There's no mention of Jesus in any of his many works which meditate on the afterlife. There's no eschatological language that you might find in the Gospels or the Acts of the Apostles or in Paul's letters or in Revelation or anything like that. So he's not looking in that direction. In terms of finding comfort in the end of his life, I think Mahler was a distinctly uncomfortable person for his whole life, probably. He came at the end of his life, where else? To the New World, which was not so new anymore. He came to New York City. And he he lived and worked in Manhattan, and he conducted what was then the nascent New York Philharmonic Orchestra. He was a very polarizing figure, Mahler, because as a director and a conductor, he asked for the maximum effort from everybody. His rehearsals went notoriously long. If he wasn't pleased with how they went, he might make it go even longer. If a musician was not hacking it, he might call them out and embarrass that musician in the rehearsal. In his own personal life, he never found much solace, much comfort, much stability. He married a very high-profile socialite by the name of Alma Schindler, Mahler, and she would cheat on him in a very scandalous, high-profile affair with an architect from the Bauhaus, who, of all the names in the world to be cuckolded by, it was a guy named Walter Gropius. I'm not making this up. Gropius. That's right, his wife went to bed with a guy named Gropius. And he died, by the way, of pericarditis when he was 51. So Mahler, again, another person who did not live a particularly long life. His years are 1860 to 1911. And of course, getting back to the question about how to appreciate this kind of music, when he died, there wasn't a big market for his music. He was not very much appreciated by contemporaries in that period because it was very hard to listen to that music. Where would you go? Once the composer dies, their music is going to become, again, for some time at least, and this is not every composer, but for many composers, it happens that their music sort of goes into a stasis of sorts. And it's not until later on when it's resurrected. Bach is a great example. But Mahler, it was impossible to listen to Mahler's works with the recording technology up until the 1950s. How could you listen to this on a 78 RPM record? You couldn't. You had to wait till the technology caught up. And even then, you would require several audio cassettes, right? Several vinyl records. So it took a while for this music to become popular. It was not until the second half of the 20th century that Mahler was really celebrated for what he accomplished. Of course, it goes without saying that during the Nazi era in Europe, his music was considered Entartete, which is a specific German word that they used, which means degenerate. So there you have it. His conversion didn't mean a thing to the Nazis.
Based on the question about appreciation, how would you assess the future of the enjoyment of symphonies and classical music based upon the easy gratification of youth? Do you see a resurgence? Obviously you hope for a resurgence, but...
It's a good question about the way that younger generations appreciate this music. Let me say two things about it. Number one, there are probably people who would give you a sky is falling doomsday scenario and say it's all got there's a timer ticking and there's only so much time. But I don't think that's true. I think in many ways it's probably not so different than how people listened to music in the 1960s when people wanted rock and roll and they wanted gyrating hips and they wanted sort of, Bob Dylan-esque lyrics which were sort of cutting and very politically resonating. My experience has been working with that younger demographic is that, again, they don't know this music exists. Once they become aware of it, all of a sudden it's on their radar. And I've had many emails from students 2 years after they take a music appreciation class. I just want you to know, Professor, that I had a really awful day at work today in my new job. And I came home and I put on Mozart's Piano Concerto in A major, and it just put me in a much better mood. So I think part of what people like myself do in terms of bringing this music to students on a college campus where they wouldn't ordinarily hear it. Yeah, is it something that's going to dominate their listening playlist? No, probably not. But once they become aware of it, once they're introduced to it, it becomes something that they go back to, especially when they mature and get into their mid to late 20s, more and more. And my sense is that there will always be a market for this music. I'm often asked, what kind of music do you like? Some of you have heard me say this before. And my answer is good music. I don't like to say, well, I like Baroque music, and I used to say that when I was 22. I would say, well, I really like, Baroque Lutheran oratorios. What does that mean to most people? Oreos? I like good music, and this is good music, and I think there will always be a market for good music. Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, maybe one more question, Amara, and then we'll wrap it up. Yeah. Yes, I know they did it. Yeah.
And I certainly wish I'd heard your lecture before I heard it. But they said the reason they chose that in connection with the Leonard Bernstein weekend was because he was a great devotee of Mahler.
That's absolutely true. Yeah.
Did not say why, other than some of the things you may have been saying that may be the same reasons. But what particular were the inspirations of Mahler to Leonard Bernstein?
Well, okay, so first of all, we should probably establish a little bit of a chain here. Bernstein was a great devotee of Mahler's and was a noted interpreter and conductor of Mahler's symphonies. So let's talk about inspiration. Okay, go back to Mahler himself. Mahler himself was inspired primarily by Beethoven, but also I think to a great degree by Wagner, because he gravitated towards that was dramatic. If you like Wagner, it's probably because you like things that have sort of very, in some cases, confusing plots. But I think more so what Wagner was going for and what appealed to Mahler about that was the layers, the dimension, the intricacy, the number of moving parts to coordinate. Fast forward to the 19-teens and 1920s, the composers who embraced Mahler shortly after he died were people like Toscanini, Bruno Walter, another one, people who appreciated the scope of what he was doing. And of course, Bernstein, somebody who was one of these people who lived with the scores. If you ever watch those omnibus videos or the Young People's Concert Series videos, Bernstein just drums up a piece and he just plays it, doesn't it? This is the development section from the third movement of Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, and he just starts playing it. So I think what appealed to him about Mahler was the intricacy, the expressivity, and of course the reason Tanglewood did it was because not only did Bernstein have a long-standing affiliation with Tanglewood, but because this past summer in August, it would have marked Bernstein's 100th birthday. So all those reasons and more, but another way of putting it, which I could say, but I don't know that I would put this in writing, but I'll say it because we're among friends. Great musicians tend to really like Mahler. Great musicians tend to like Mahler. I'll leave the rest unsaid. Okay. All right. Thank you so much, everybody.